Please understand, we don't want no trouble. We just want the right to be different. That's all. That is on the inside sleeve of Pulp's great album, Different Class, released in the late summer of 1995. Ideally probably regarded as one of the best Britpop albums that there is. And on this one, episode 165 of Mark's Notcast, I'm going to be talking through what happened 25 years ago this year, primarily to tie in with the release of Oasis at Knebworth, which came out last week on DVD, CD, LP, box set, no doubt 8-track tape, and it's a lot more expensive now to buy than gig tickets were on the day. The question I was always asked when I was younger, one of the big questions about whether you can be friends with someone, because you had to take a side, was Oasis or Blur. Well, my answer was always Suede and Pulp. Oasis and Blur were probably third and fourth, and down below at 27th were people like Shed 7 and the artistically stunted menswear, who I absolutely do not like at all. Today I'm going to talk through Britpop. Now ideally I'd be completely in the target market for the Knebworth release. No great surprise to you to realise that I am significantly older than I was in 1996 when these shows happened. And when these shows happened, I was in my early to mid-20s, probably the absolute zenith of my youth. And Britpop would have been the thing which was happening all around me, and I felt somehow strangely detached from all of it that was going on around me. It felt like I was observing almost an occupation by another invading force into my own life rather than actually experiencing Britpop. Now, maybe some people can say, well, if you can remember it, you weren't there. I was there. I remember it. And you may not necessarily believe me. I've never taken any illegal drugs in my life. So my memories are probably a lot better than they would have been for a lot of people. The problem that we have with Oasis at Knebworth is that now, 25 years on, I'm probably the complete target market for this release. I'm somebody who either was there then or was paying attention, and there's no lie to say my life is a little bit better, and I'm earning a little bit more money than I was when I was 23 years old. And so therefore I'm probably the complete target market of someone who would probably buy Oasis at Knebworth. And yes, you got me, I own it. That's absolutely no shame on my part, by the way. I liked Oasis despite the people and the fans that went around it. I certainly didn't like Oasis because of it. I went to a number of Oasis gigs in the late 90s. My last Oasis show was at the Reading Festival in the year 2000, which was, put bluntly, awful, and I just gave up at that point. I wasn't enjoying the shows. I wasn't enjoying the people that came to the shows. It didn't feel like my kind of crowd. Much like Jesus, as John Lennon said, the worst thing about Oasis was often their fans. I'm going to talk about the DVD release, the audio release, the documentaries that come with it, and then I'm going to talk about my experiences of living through Britpop in 1995 and 1996, and I'm not going to pull any punches when I start talking about it, by the way. I am going to get into politics, I'm going to get into sexism, I'm going to get into racism, I'm going to get into a lot of the things that have happened as a result of Britpop happening in 1995. First and foremost, Oasis at Knebworth was absolutely, definitely one of the very, very biggest gigs in the history of Britain ever, and there were lots and lots of things that were happening around that. The more attentive of you will have known that Knebworth was the last major show that came on the heels of What's the Story, Morning Glory. Here's a 1995 Creation Records version of that, the double album with the extra track Bonehead's Bank Holiday, which is not particularly good, truth be told. And What's the Story, Morning Glory has had two long-standing effects upon culture and society ever since. The first one is it introduced what's known as the Loudness Wars. So if you're listening to modern radio, you're listening to modern CDs, and you're going, that is compressed and smashed to fuck, and I can barely hear the drums, or it's really loud and it gives me a headache. Oasis's What's the Story, Morning Glory is the album that started all of this. The instruction was to make the album louder, as loud as possible, so that when it came on the radio, when it came onto CD players, when you played it in your car, it was louder than everything else. It stood out, and that's a trick which everyone has kind of followed ever since. It's a really good LP, What's the Story, Morning Glory. It's suffers from a couple of Dove tracks on there. Sorry guys, She's Electric is never going to be the best song that was ever written by anybody ever, despite what Noel Gallagher will tell you. And the Beatles weren't the best band ever. And it wore its influences very, very clearly on its sleeve. I always was quite surprised by Noel going on about the Beatles being the best band ever, because, mate, if you're going to champion a band, how about a band that didn't conquer the universe for 10 years and didn't sell more records than God himself? Would be a good place to start. On the hot on the heels of What's the Story, Morning Glory, there also came a plethora of artistically stunted sound-alike bands that are absolutely terrible. So, for example, when people said Oasis or Blur, my response was always Suede and Pulp. Oasis and Blur were maybe third and fourth. Shed 7 was something like number 27. Menswear were somewhere in about 134, and the only good thing about Menswear albums was the silence between the songs, which were never long enough. Now that sounds very bitchy. I am afraid to say totally bitchy about this period of my life. And What's the Story, Morning Glory has another kind of side effect, is that I'm very firmly of the belief that without What's the Story, Morning Glory and Oasis at Knebworth and Noel Jack having a Union Jack guitar, that Brexit would never have happened. And I'll explain it later from my opinion. Here's a 3 CD version of What's the Story, Morning Glory. Now you may think, well, why is this guy who doesn't like this band buying all these things? Well, I like the music. There's a lot of things about Oasis that I didn't like. And I'm going to have to be open and honest about that when I get to talking through it. Now, I was hoping this would have a shot of Noel Gallagher's infamous Union Jack guitar. You know damn well which one I'm talking about. And that would kind of talk about the reappropriation or the reclaiming of certain bits of, iconic imagery. And reclaiming them back from people that perhaps weren't the loveliest people in the world. I think I'll get to that later if that's okay with you. Now, the releases that happened around this period, there was, just after Knebworth, there was a sell-through VHS. Here is the DVD version. It's called There and Then, which was filmed at the shows at Manchester Main Road. And for a long period of time, the only track from Knebworth that was officially released was on this shrink-wrap CD that came with the early VHS editions of There and Then, which features Champagne Supernova live at Knebworth Park on the 11th of August 1996 with John Squire of the Stone Roses on guitar. And there are a lot of other kind of live things that went on around about this time. There was a Super Golden radio show, which was recorded, I think, at the Patriot Centre in Fairfax, wherever the hell that is. There's the Main Event, which was the bootleg CD of the Manchester Main Road show, featuring the band's Spitting Image dummies on there. And there was also, of course, the MTV Unplugged show, which Liam didn't go to because he got drunk. And then there was the Live at Knebworth 1996 bootleg CD. This sold a lot of copies. Knebworth 1996 was the biggest show in Britain's calendar for years, either side of it. 240,000 people went to these shows. The guest list on each show was very nearly 10,000 to 15,000 people per show. You will never meet that many people, but that's how many people were on the guest list for these shows. Suddenly, you find success makes you very, very popular, and failure is, of course, an orphan. And Knebworth was broadcast on the radio. The second night was broadcast. This is the copy of the second night, which up to about 3/4 of the way through was a live broadcast, and then switched over to the night before, primarily to make sure that the two previously unreleased Oasis songs that they were playing on this tour, It's Getting Better Man and My Big Mouth, were not bootlegged, which means that the mixing desk recordings of Knebworth from 1996 is a composite of both nights. Little tracks have been drip fed out in little itty bitty packages here and there and everywhere, but it certainly wasn't the all resounding success. Maybe they had an eye on 25 years from now, when the band have split up and I'm finally tired of working with Liam, that perhaps I'll be able to release a DVD. So, Oasis at Knebworth. What was it like? I don't know. I didn't go. I did see Oasis on this tour this year. I saw them at the Cardiff International Arena on the 18th of March 1996. Sold out very, very quickly. We drove up after work. We drove back after the show. I got in at about 2 o'clock in the morning. I didn't even drink any alcohol, but I did have a rushed battered sausage afterwards, and I felt very, very queasy and actually vomited on the train, which was a terrible state of affairs. And I'm very sorry to the people on the 7:47 train going into Birmingham New Street that next morning. I felt really, really poorly. I've not felt so poorly on my trip into work ever, actually. And because I was sober, I can't even blame it on the alcohol. I have to blame it on a chip shop in Charlotte Street in Cardiff, which we ate from about 11 o'clock at night. At least I think it's called Charlotte Street. It might be known as Chip Shop Alley. Who knows? Everyone who's been to Cardiff knows exactly where that is. This release comes in a multitude of formats: an LP box set, CDs, DVDs, Blu-rays, vinyl, probably 8-track tape for all I know. And it contains the 2 full shows plus a documentary DVD. The documentary DVD is the one that was shown in British cinemas about 2 months ago. And what I will say is, talking about the documentary, is that it's very unusual. It's a first, I think, for me to experience almost a mythologizing of what I actually lived through at the time. I experienced this by listening to it on the radio. I experienced it by going to the shows and going to the nightclubs, and I experienced it by buying the records when they came out. And of course, people will say, if you can remember it, you weren't there. Well, I didn't go to Knebworth, so I can't remember it. But you look at that, and suddenly you find out that something like 22 times the number of tickets that could be sold, people applied for. Something like 2.7 million people tried to buy tickets for Oasis at Knebworth and were unable to secure tickets. For the Knebworth shows, by the way, the band were rehearsing at the Birmingham NEC, which was about 5 miles away from my house. And I bumped into a couple of people on a night out who had actually watched Oasis do a full run through of the show at the Birmingham NEC, which is a conference centre. And there's 3 discs on this release. The first one is the documentary, and this is where we see a mythologizing of something that perhaps wasn't all that great to start with. If you look through the credits, there's a reenactment unit, which means they have somehow got old mobile phones and dial tone phones and 90s t-shirts, and they've pulled them out from some archive somewhere, and they've got people to pretend to be people from the 90s, buying tickets by ringing the phone number endlessly, and of course buying tickets over the counter. And then in the age before mobile phones, when you went there, you had to meet your friends at a certain place, you had to go around to the house, you had to drive to the place, and then you had to make sure you didn't lose your friends throughout the course of the day, because then you would never see them again. So when I went to a couple of outdoor shows in the 90s, because you didn't have mobile phones, if you lost your friends and the place was so big, for example, I split up with my friends quite early in the day, and then I didn't see them until I got back to the car at the end of the show. Quite an unusual experience. Very, very possible to spend the whole of a Knebworth show and not actually see your friends once you've missed them, because you've had to go to the loo. And you had to plan, because it was so big as well, being 130,000 people, is that you would go, right, so if I need to go to the loo, I have to decide when I'm going to go, because it's going to take me 15 minutes to get there and 15 minutes to get back, even though it's a 3-minute walk, because the place is so goddamn huge. When I went to see Robbie Williams at Knebworth in 2003 with Moby and the Darkness supporting, Darkness were fantastic that day. I was very, very aware that even though it felt like I was actually watching them from another planet, I was actually in the first quarter of the crowd, because the crowd was so big. It's a bizarre state of affairs. It really, really is. My short way of telling you this is, don't go to gigs at Knebworth. They're absolutely huge, and it takes you forever to get out of the car park. When we got out of Knebworth, we didn't leave the car park until 3 a.m. We didn't get home until 6 a.m. I'm really glad that it was on a Saturday, so that we could not have to worry about going to work the next morning. Disc 1 is the documentary, and the strange thing about the documentary is almost everybody is interviewed, apart from Alan White, the band's drummer, and Giggsy, the band's bass player. Giggsy, as I understand it, doesn't do interviews. Alan White, I think, when he left the group, signed some form of NDA where he agrees not to talk about Oasis in return for some money in order to become unemployed, and therefore isn't asked for it. Bonehead gets maybe about 5% of the interview time. Liam probably gets about 30%, Noel probably gets about 40%, and Noel and Liam are not on speaking terms, or at least they weren't the last time I heard. So it's a very, very strange recontextualization of what happened, which isn't necessarily everybody's experience of what went down on the day. It's a good documentary. It's interesting. They have lots of fan stories that from people that attended the shows, and that's an interesting and nice thing to have. But it's not ultimately fully satisfying. They also make a big deal out of pointing out that only 10 people were arrested over the weekend. Having seen the Oasis DVD Familiar to Millions, where they follow the security crew around on one of the DVD extras, I'm very surprised by that state of affairs. And of course, there's no recognition of the fact that if the police arrest you, that is almost definitely the very last option. They're going to try everything else first before they can do it. The other two discs, this is the DVD copy, are the two nights in question, featuring the professionally shot and mixed audio and video from the shows. These are not the previously existing and circulating screen feeds, that is, the stuff that was shown on the TV screens either side of the stage. These have been re-edited and recompiled, and as I understand it, Liam's vocals have a different audio engineer than the rest of the set, which kind of indicates that there's some kind of difference of opinion between some of the members of the band. And the two shows are really, really good, by the way. They're full shows. They include all the chat that I remember happening. However, everything looks better when viewed through a rear view mirror. And there's lots of things that this documentary DVD doesn't show and doesn't touch upon. And there is a lovely moment at the end of the second night where you can see Liam and Noel looking at each other, and they're just having this lovely, lovely moment of pure joy, going, we did it, we played Knebworth, for God's sake, couldn't believe it. And you can just feel the glee kind of just coming out of the screen there. It's absolutely lovely. But that said, if you have a brother and you have argued with him, you also know that sometimes brothers do things that your friends know that you absolutely should never do. And your friends, if they knew that you did some of the things that you did, your friends would be, you're not my friend anymore. It's a bit harder to break up with your brother. And having been in a band with my brother, I can confess that, there are things that my brother has done, which had he been a friend of mine, I would never have spoken to him again. And that's probably as much information as I'm prepared to tell you. Not everybody is absolutely lovely, and certainly the offstage lives of at least one member of Oasis has been pretty controversial, I think it's fair to say. So Oasis at Knebworth, fantastic DVD. Best option to go for if you're on a budget, get the 3 DVD version. It's in HMV at the moment for £13.99, and for that you get 2 full Oasis shows on a DVD, or 2 DVDs, and you get the documentary. And if you've got a DVD audio extractor, you can rip the audio in high quality WAVs straight out of your DVD and onto your computer, so you don't even have to pay to get the download or the audio CD. And that's probably where I'm going to leave it. Now, the other thing I will say about Britpop is, having lived it at the time, there are some notable omissions around the experience of being alive in 1995 and 1996. And I think there's a book by I think John Harris called The Last Party. There's a documentary called Live Forever. But again, everything is touched with this hazy, almost romantic glow of, how brilliant it was when we were young. And the answer is, it wasn't that great, actually, to be there. It wasn't that great to live through Britpop at the time. I didn't enjoy huge chunks of it. And I'll come at it from 2 angles. The first one is around my personal experiences. Oasis made no bones about the fact that they wanted to be the biggest band in the world, and they wanted to be bigger than the world if they possibly could. The only thing that rivaled the size of their ambition was the size of Noel's talent, both of which were quite big. And make no mistake about it, Noel, fantastic songwriter, lots and lots of talent at the time. He could shit gold before breakfast, and they did B-sides that most bands would have made their entire careers out of. The other side of it was, of course, with them being the biggest band in the world, suddenly what you found is that the genres of music that I enjoyed, rock, indie, electronica, bits of metal, they were not outsider experiences anymore. So, for example, if I liked a smallish indie band, I knew if I went to the nightclubs that played their music, I knew if I went to their shows, I knew that I would be in a safe space. I'd be surrounded by people that had a similar mindset to me, maybe a similar set of ethics. I knew that, for example, the shows that I went to were generally not going to be violent. They were generally not going to be drunks. They were generally not going to be groping men there. And what I found is when Oasis became absolutely enormous, is suddenly all the safe spaces I went to escape from the parts of my reality I didn't like were no longer safe spaces. And so, for example, if I went to an Oasis gig, there's a very high probability that I would find myself standing next to the kid who bullied me at school. Now, I was bullied at school. There is no reason why somebody is bullied at school apart from the fact that they're at school, they're there. And that's the thing with bullies, is that they don't need a reason, they just need an object to pick on and to express their frustrations through. And they knew better, but they didn't care. And so, for example, the music, which to me had become a map when I was lost in the world, had become the soundtrack to a drink and a grope. And so, for example, when I was watching Suede, or when I was watching Pulp, or when I was watching some of the other bands, and this is why I stopped seeing Oasis, these songs, which had great meaning to me and had helped me through difficult times in my life, had become the soundtrack to the kid that used to punch me at school because I had glasses and looked funny. Became the soundtrack to his ability to try and cop off with girls, and saw going down the front of the gig as an excuse to be able to feel up a girl's bum, or to, whatever it was that they were doing. Or if some bloke looked at them funny, is to have a fight. And this is the worst thing about seeing some bands, even now, is, if you go and see certain bands of certain ages. I noticed it a little bit at New Order, not so much that. Definitely the last time I saw Take That, when the last time I saw the Stone Roses, is that the worst thing about the show was the crowd, because the crowd, there were lots of people who I would not hang out with through choice if I had the choice to do so. It was suddenly the spaces where I went to, where I felt safe and accepted because I was weird and unusual and all that stuff, were not safe anymore. I had been followed, almost. The places where I went to escape from the world had started to follow me in. The world had got in there. And so, for example, on the not that I would recommend that you do this, but the Oasis show at Wembley Stadium in the year 2000, this was the second night that was shown. The first night, Liam was, putting it technically, ripped to the tits, absolutely steaming drunk, and so much so to the point where it's embarrassing to watch. It's all on YouTube, by the way. That show will almost definitely never be released, but it is awful to see someone headlining Wembley Stadium and being so absolutely incapable of doing their job competently. Liam was, in some respects, a figurehead. So people looked at the way in which Liam behaved at this point. He was a drunk. He was a bit handsy. He had a reputation for being a ladies' man, whether the ladies were, that excited about it or not. He could be a bit violent. And he was basically like a 14-year-old that never grew up. And so on the Wembley DVD, although it's not shown on the Wembley DVD, the Wembley TV broadcast, there's a bit where he basically goads a woman on national television to get her tits out for the lads, which... Now, I'm younger than Liam. Not by much, but I am. And I knew then, even then I knew, this is not cool, guys. This is not cool. Because either you shame the woman on national television for not getting her tits out, or you give everybody a cheap thrill on national television by a woman bearing her breasts when she doesn't want to. And so what we had in Liam was a bad role example, by the way, and that was part of the rise of lad culture, which to me really poisoned the whole experience for me. Now the thing with lad culture is the strapline underneath Loaded magazine, which was launched by a music writer called James Brown, it was for men who should know better. As if there was some way of saying, well, we know this is bad, but we're going to do it anyway. And there was a huge undercurrent in Britpop of sexism, misogyny, toxic masculinity, toxic nationalism, and toxic identity. And I want to explain why, because it was really uncomfortable to live through this. When I said that, going to these shows felt like being living in an occupied country that had been occupied by by an invading army, is that I was going to these gigs long before these things were popular, and all of a sudden, the kids that I was trying to get away from were there, and there were millions of them, like Zulus, thousands of them everywhere, and you couldn't escape them. And there was a rise of lad culture at the same time. There was a rise of sexism. There was a rise of entitled masculinity that said, well, because I'm a bloke, I have the right to do this. And it's not. It's absolutely not. People were hiding behind it as an excuse to be horrible human beings and get away with it. Liam was doing exactly the same thing. He was... you can Google all the times that he's done terrible things. Wikipedia has a long list of them. Hopefully he's bucked his ideas up and is a better human being now, but he wasn't at the time. And I'm pretty confident in saying that without Oasis, without the Union Jacks, without the rise of lad culture, Brexit wouldn't have happened and Boris Johnson wouldn't be Prime Minister, because Boris Johnson is an example on what would happen if lad culture had gone into politics. You've got a guy that's generally thoughtless, unafraid to threaten violence to people. There are tapes of him threatening people or offering to have people done in who have written things about him that he doesn't like, and has a minimum of 6 children, for example. And with Britpop, we had a huge rise in sexism. There was a knee-jerk excuse for bad behaviour. It was a knee-jerk response to things like sensitivity and thoughtfulness. It was something that saw things like consideration for other human beings and consent as merely useless baggage to be discarded. The logical extension of this is people would have looked at those people as as role models, and would have then gone, okay, so the logical extension of having role models that were sexist and promiscuous, very promiscuous and violent and uncaring and unthinking and generally selfish, is that the logical extension of that is things like drink spiking, sexual assault, misogyny, incompetence in major positions of public power and authority, and a culture of exceptionalism, where all that matters is that somebody believes that they're absolutely brilliant, and they don't actually have to be absolutely brilliant. What matters then is they think they're brilliant, and then unless somebody calls them out on their bullshit, they just keep getting away with it. Now, there was the flip side of that is some people said that it was men who saw themselves as being battered by feminism. And actually, equality is not anything to be scared of unless you're not very good and you'll get found out and it will disadvantage you. We had a culture of exceptionalism where people thought, well, because I'm British, I'm brilliant. Because I'm a man, I'm brilliant. And it kind of works now, even through the structure of society with things like paternity leave and maternity leave and all that type of stuff. And there was an opportunity to overturn all of those attitudes, which didn't happen. And instead what you had was frankly a bit of an idiot going around who was sleeping with a lot of women and behaving like being an alcoholic womanizer was the most amazing thing in the world, and because he had a golden throat was getting away with it. So there were elements of Britpop that were sexist, homophobic, racist, had a determined war against intelligence, and where people were penalised for having, a brain. So, for example, and I will mention it quickly here, this is a really useful book, really interesting and well-written book, Different for Girls by Louise Mina, who was the vocalist in, and still is the vocalist in, a band called Sleeper, who were very big on Britpop at the time. And if you want to reference it, check your sources, page 270, by the way. The NME front cover, the only reason they got NME front covers is they said, we'll do an NME front cover, but only if it's a picture of just you. If we ask for a band picture, then they'll pull it. And we don't want them to pull it because the front cover of that Star mag is not going to happen unless you get the NME. And the photographer said you were difficult to work with. And, what you've got is, then you've got TFI Friday, where they said, did you happen to see TFI Friday last night? And he goes, no, why? Ginger Tips announced live in air that you were coming on next week to do a sketch without asking. So Chris Evans, TFI Friday, the biggest pre-pub television that there was in the UK, announced that Louise Mina was coming on to TFI Friday to do a sketch next week. And not only did it was news. And it was like, but it's nothing weird, no impersonations, and if you do the sketch, you'll get to play your single live on the show the following week. And if I don't, they'll give the shot to Shed 7. Somebody asks me when I arrive at Riverside Studios if I've remembered to bring my outfit. What outfit? I say. Sexy school teacher. Didn't they tell you? That was the fucking world we had to live in. Sexist idiots assuming that they could do that kind of behaviour. That stuff is bloody disgusting, and it happens to this day. And a huge chunk of it came from the fact that things like Oasis, no one was able to call out the behaviours that we had. We had the video for Blur's Country House that was very obviously and deliberately, it was allegedly a pastiche of Carry On movies from the 70s. But Carry On movies from the 70s were like sexist and shit and not funny. And like watching someone get like a mustard pie in their face or something. It was like just awful. Why were we doing this? And this is why I felt like an outsider in the midst of Britpop, because I was sat there going, God damn it, humans, we're better than this shit. We don't have to be sexist. We don't have to be racist. We don't have to be homophobic. We don't have to be acting like idiots. And if you aren't acting and behaving under your intelligence level, you're letting yourself down. You're letting everybody down, actually. And this sounds horrendously like, oh, God, Guardian reader having a go about Britpop. Oh, you didn't have any fun. I had a blast through most of it. But at the same point, I was on the other side of the room to the sexist, racist lads that were drunk and would touch up my girlfriend. And you realise that if you said anything to you, they'd punch the glasses right off your face, stick you in A&E and fuck up your life because they could get away with it because they'd had a few drinks and there weren't enough security guards there. It was like being trapped in a crappy nightclub on a Friday night whilst a band that you loved were playing music over there. And these groups were emboldened by the environments that they were in. And so the safe spaces that I had when I started going to gigs in 1991, there was very definitely a sense of, this is my place, this is my home, this is somewhere where I can go, where the people that make my life difficult and that treat me like shit are not here. And then all of a sudden they were there and they followed me in. And it was awful. It really was. And this is why I stopped seeing the Stone Roses. It's why I stopped seeing Oasis, because I was surrounded by people that were drunk and selfish. They didn't care who they upset. They didn't care if they spilt your beer. They didn't care if they said something about your girlfriend to your face. They don't care about any of that stuff. It's just a fucking laugh. Lighten up, mate. It's just a fucking laugh. Fucking lighten up. Stop being such a fucking fuck. It's just like, you are not a nice guy, whoever you are, And if your girlfriend didn't have blonde hair, then they'd be go, oh, your bird's ugly. If she didn't have big tits, well, what are you going out with her for? If she wore glasses, like, why do you want to fuck a swat? It's stupidity, and it's just really. It was really unpleasant to be around. I hated it, and that's why I stopped going to see Oasis. And by the way, when we were talking about Noel's guitar with the Union Jack on it, the Union Jack was a verboten symbol. It carried a heavy weight next to it until Noel started sticking it on his guitar. So the idea was, you're going to reclaim the Union Jack. And there's nothing wrong with being proud of being British, as long as Britain is something to be proud of. And people forgot the last part of that. They just, well, I'm British, and that makes me better than you. And the Union Jack at that point had been appropriated by, it was probably last seen in popular culture around skinheads and mods and quadrophenia and all that kind of stuff. But it was also something that was tied to far right organisations like the National Front, Combat 18, a kind of British nationalism around that. And then by Noel surfacing that, what he thought he was probably doing was reclaiming the Union Jack as a symbol of pride in Britain, as a cultural ambassador, etc., etc. But what it really did is it opened the door for these kind of people to go, we were always using that. That's ours. And it didn't take the power back. And so the rise of having the Union Jack as a symbol on Noel's guitar, without which I don't think the ultimate logical extension is Brett Brexit wouldn't have happened, because there was this concept of British exceptionalism. And of course, Oasis were British, they're not bloody French, bloody frogs, Germans. Yeah, horrible people. They don't get it. Like when he said the Americans just do not get it. It's like Britain is the only country that gets it. We're the best country in the world. It doesn't matter if we're the best. What matters is we're the best. We're British because we're British. We're the best. And it's like, where's your evidence to back that up, apart from the fact that the Beatles were British ones? And what you had then is that the concept of rule Britannia ruling the radio waves and all that stuff kind of overtook the rest of the cultural dialogue. And so we never had a section where anybody claimed it back and went, nah, that's shit, mate. Because the British people don't want to think of Britain being anything less than being absolutely fucking brilliant. And of course we see that in today's politics. We see that in the mindless boosterism of the woefully incompetent Boris Johnson, and we see it in the flippancy around the way in which people treat very, very serious subjects. And so the Union Jack and the idea of Britain being absolutely brilliant and better than anywhere else meant that Britain then started to change its form of conversation. In politics, there's a concept called the Overton Window. And the Overton Window is there's an acceptable kind of circle of political discourse and ideas. And the Overton Window has been dragged so far to the right, it is now out of the room and in the car park. Whereas, some of the policies which people regard as broadband socialism and mindless spoony communism, what's wrong with not having people starve to death if they haven't got money? What's wrong with the idea of being part of Europe? And it's like, no, Britain, we're just British, mate, just British. Stop putting Britain down. We are better than other places, and we're not better, we're not worse, we're just different, but without the rise of Britpop, without the fetishization of the Union Jack, without the glorification of unthinking and mindless behaviour, I think Brexit wouldn't have happened, and I think people wouldn't have voted for Boris Johnson. Because when people vote for Boris Johnson, and if you vote for Boris Johnson, that's not a good idea, guys. Don't do it, okay? What you're voting for is, you're not voting for a politician, you're voting for a game show host. And that is very, very similar to when Keith Sutherland records his terrible country and western albums. If you actually have to live with the consequences, you realise you shouldn't be buying them, and you shouldn't be putting game show hosts in as politicians and leaders of a country, because they're just not good enough to do the job. So, unfortunately, for me, the rise of Britpop was the start of the downfall of Britain, because Britain started believing that it was fantastic without necessarily needing the evidence to back it up. And there was on one hand, the lower dregs of Britpop is basically potato rock as sung by traffic wardens that have never had an original idea in their heads. And the flip side of the kind of the very kind of masculine, toxic masculinity that came around with the sexism of Blur's Country House video and with Oasis. Now, the Spice Girls, by the way, were a brilliant response to that, with girl power, trying to reclaim, back the power from men, and it worked to an extent, but it didn't stick, and that is a great, great shame. Which is my way of saying Oasis at Knebworth, it really wasn't all that and a bag of chips. If you were there, you'll know that it had a dark, nasty undercurrent to it. There was a lot of drugs, there was a lot of sexism, there was a little bit of violence, there was a huge chunk of racism, huge chunk of exceptionalism, which was completely unwarranted, by the way, because any country that's produced Menwear and Northern Uproar needs to grovel to the rest of the world for the terrible crimes it's inflicted upon our ears. And you had kind of like a toxic nationality, a toxic masculinity. You had almost a toxic identity where somehow people believed, because they were British and had penises, that they were automatically better than anyone else, and they were excused from the normal sets of responsibilities and obligations that all other human beings are meant to follow by. And of course, those people stormed in by the thousands into Oasis shows, and I stopped going to Oasis shows because it wasn't safe. I didn't feel safe. I felt threatened, and I felt like I didn't belong anymore in my own country. So, when people say Oasis or Blur, it's always pulp and suede. Please understand, we don't want no trouble. We just want the right to be different. That's all.